Well, I'm very excited to be at the NVS. I'm easily excited, but actually the NVS is a wonderful place to be. And you gave me an opportunity to think about, let me see, my slides have stuck. There we are. Your invitation has invited me to think a little bit differently. I always welcome opportunities to talk, maybe because I'm talkative, but also because a new audience makes you think slightly differently. And I designed initially what I was going to say this morning for new visitors to Cambridge. So I thought I would focus on criminal justice within Cambridgeshire. I then realized that actually a lot of you would be old hands in Cambridge, and therefore I should be a bit more careful. You've turned out to be a rather difficult audience because some of you are very expert and some of you are newly arrived in Cambridge. So I hope that there will be something for everyone, and I don't intend to talk for more than certainly at most half an hour, and then we'll be very, very happy to discuss things with you further. So I'm popping through the criminal justice system. Slide number 1 is policing. I could spend the 30 minutes on policing, of course, but for those who are new to this country, we still have 44 different police forces in England and Wales. Why is a very, very good question. Cambridgeshire Constabulary can't afford a helicopter to sniff out drugs. We share it with 2 adjoining constabularies. Is it sensible to have 43 local police forces? For me, one of the important questions is questions of accountability. Who do the police, who holds them to account? We had very dramatic changes about 10 years ago in this country when we got rid of, I thought, a rather good system of accountability of local police authorities. And now we have elected police and crime commissioners, which to my mind are very bad systems in that they are deeply political. Not many people bother to vote for them, so they're not even democratic. And there are lots of issues about accountability. There are also lots and lots of questions about whether you need a local police force or a national police force, or indeed a global police force. Dick Hobbs coined the phrase in criminal justice of glocalization. And I think localization for the police is a very wise expression. You need local and global. Get them together, glocal. Talk to most police officers, they certainly don't want more powers, but of course they want more resources. Then we go on to my next slide, which is, if I can make it go on, the Crown Prosecution Service. Now the Crown Prosecution Service, who are the state body, which we've only had since 1985, is divided very differently to the police. We've got 43, all these police forces, but many fewer Crown Prosecution Service areas. So the Crown Prosecution Service in this area is the east of England, and to check, it's Norfolk, Suffolk, Essex, and Cambridgeshire. It would be really fun with the NVS to get the new visitors to Cambridge to play the geography of England and Wales, to play with maps and insert the counties. You'll discover as I go on that the different criminal justice bodies all include lots of different bodies, and different counties are collected in different ways. So for the Crown Prosecution Service, it's Norfolk, Suffolk, Essex, and Cambridgeshire. We're right on the west of that. When we come to the probation in a minute, you'll see we're right on the east of our grouping. Nothing quite makes sense. The Crown Prosecution Service is in charge of prosecutions. And I think the most interesting question for me, apart from resources, and resources, is whether you can effectively have an independent prosecution service grafted onto a police system, because the independent Crown Prosecution Service doesn't have its own police force, of course. They rely on the police for the evidence that they're thinking about. So when they make the decisions to prosecute, to what extent are they truly independent? I mentioned the RASO units there because rape is deeply controversial and we should all worry about the prosecutions of rape. Why are so few rapists convicted, if you like? Why is the acquittal rate so high? Well, that's because the police and the CPS now trust complainants more than they used to. They want the jury to decide whether they believe the complainant. And it's very difficult. If you are raped in Cambridge, you'll probably go to the Elms in Hinchinbrook to be treated, I hope, extremely nicely by the police. But then the RASO unit for the CPS is, of course, not in Huntingdon. And the joining up of rape investigations is really, really interesting. At the moment, we're seeing the convictions go up a little bit, but that's because the CPS are dropping more cases. The vast majority of rapes, of course, happen between people who know each other, and therefore the jury has the really difficult job of deciding who they believe. More of that a little bit later on. Moving on now to the courts. In Cambridgeshire, we have lay magistrates deciding the vast majority of crime. The Crown Court in Cambridge is a very splendid place on East Road, well worth visiting. And in the Crown Court of serious crime, where it's trial by jury, we extol the system of trial by jury in many ways in this country, but actually very few people have a trial by jury. The vast majority of cases begin and end in the Magistrates' Court, and of those which go to the Crown Court, the majority of people plead guilty, which shows that trial by jury is very limited. If you're interested in how either Magistrates or Crown Court sentence, please do go to that website. I'm very happy for you all to have these slides if you want to. The Court of Appeal is where all appeals happen from the Crown Court, only in London. I've recently published an article with a wonderful woman called Naima Sakande, who's done a research project on why so few women appeal. And the bottom line is that it is really very, very difficult to appeal, especially if you're in prison. You have a 28-day time limit, and Naima's research with women who've gone to prison shows that they are much more worried about their children, their health, what's happened to their home before they get in touch with a lawyer, and by the time they've got in touch with a lawyer, the time limit's passed. That's another story. The big issue for me in the courts at the moment are these terrible COVID-induced backlogs. Actually, we were building up terrible backlogs before COVID came along, and now it's getting worse. Well done, Judge Rayner, I say, because he was brave enough to say, I'm not just going to keep this man in prison unconvicted for longer. I'm going to release him. If he can't have his trial, he deserves to come out. And he's now even crosser because he feels that he's been put under improper pressure to not release suspects because of delayed trials. It's a really difficult problem. The government solution, as I say, is to extend time limits. Is that the right time? Keep people in prison longer awaiting their trials, or should something more active be done about it? Moving on to criminal justice in Cambridgeshire is a thought about our prisons. We're surrounded by several, but none in Cambridge. In my perfect world, we would have small local prisons, but we don't have small local prisons. We have large prisons, which tend not to be where people are living. So we've got Whitemoor to the north, Little Hay to the northwest, Bedford to the west, High Point to the southeast. The nearest prisons for women, the private prison in Peterborough or near Heathrow Airport, Bronzefield. There are lots of questions I could talk about prisons. Why do we have so many more people in prison than any other European country? Why do we have such awful prisons? And why are they getting worse during the pandemic? Well, maybe it's obvious why they're getting worse in the pandemic, but I chose to put a quotation from the Chief Inspector of Prisons' recent visit to Whitemoor. Levels of violence and self-harm had fallen at the start of the pandemic. They were much, much too high in the previous report, but they're rising, and self-harm had returned to pre-restriction levels. It's concerning that 38% of prisoners felt unsafe at the time of our visit. I hope you agree with me that it's deeply troubling that prisoners should feel unsafe in prisons. Many people, of course, many more people don't go to prison but get a punishment in the community, probation. Everyone who goes to prison is then supervised by the probation services when they come out of prison. So probation is really, really important. Probation's a fantastic thing in principle, invented in 2007 and 1907, I'm so sorry, 1907, as the inheritors to the police court missionaries, but put in a statutory basis in 1907. And they became a national service 100 years later. And it's a fantastic thing to have a probation service, but I have to say they have been decimated by the privatisation that was introduced in 2014 to 2015, when the government sold off the majority of probation services to community rehabilitation companies. So here we have Bench. So I checked my listing of what Bench stands for: Bedfordshire, Northamptonshire, Cambridgeshire, and Hertfordshire. Everybody knew it was going to be a disaster. Everybody knew when it started it was going to be a disaster. The Chief Inspector of Probation has been shouting loudly. Bench R1 is one of the better ones, but as you can see, the quotation there from Her Majesty's Inspector of Probation is even here, it hasn't been good. And now they are all going back into the public sector in a rather complicated way. The public sector will run probation services, and we don't quite know now how they are going to contract out a lot of the services. Let's hope that it's much better than what we've seen for the last 5 years. You then have a little bit of a discussion there on that slide about what happens when people come out of prison. The reality is, as the slide says, most offenders desist from criminal lifestyles on their own initiative. People don't want to be criminals. People want to have a nice house, a nice life, a nice family, but desistance is really, really difficult. It is really difficult leading a good and useful life when you come out from prison with no money, with very little support. So that's what the academic research tells us very clearly. I then mentioned briefly, because those of you who know our system well will, I'm sure, be interested, in September this year, the government published a white paper, A Smarter Approach to Sentencing. Well, the government recognises the need for huge improvement in criminal justice, in sentencing. Is there any evidence in this white paper that will happen? I don't know. The Prison Reform Trust, an excellent NGO run by an ex-prison governor, says, well, there's nothing smart about rehashing punitive rhetoric and hoping for a different outcome. The punitive rhetoric, I'm not going to go through this. Any of you who are seriously interested can look through this slide. But a lot of what our government is promising is deeply punitive, promising much longer life sentences, promising longer sentences for most sexual and violent offenders, increased starting points for murders committed by children. You'll see I put down on the slide, oh no, they're already far, far too long. If you're an accomplice who watches your friend and don't stop him sticking a knife in someone else, you'll get 20 years minimum term at the moment. What is going to happen under these new rules? Deeply problematic, I think, a lot of these sentencing provisions. Some of it's actually very positive. Not new ideas, I would say, and we need to think very hard about how we encourage more deferred sentences or increase community sentence. But there are interesting positive proposals. Some proposals could be positive, could be negative. Out of court disposals, huge numbers of people only get cautioned by the police in old-fashioned language rather than prosecuted in the first place. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Then we have the problem of empowering probation. Well, probation officers aren't judges. Beware the dangers of unaccountable powers. The most amazing thing which has happened in prisons in very recent years is the huge increase in the number of people recalled to prison during the license, the community part of their sentence. Why? Well, because everybody is licensed now, everybody is supervised for at least a year, and probation officers are very, very overstretched. So the easy thing to do is to recall someone to prison, which of course costs somebody else's budget a lot more money than leaving them with probation. I'm nervous about this empowering probation. It could be marvelous. It could be dangerous. We're now facing a root and branch review of the parole system. Whether it's really a root and branch system, I don't know. It's got many, many questions to be asked, our parole system. Who gets out early? Who gets out late? Many of our prisons are not good places. There are lots and lots of problems for us to think about in relation to criminal justice. A question I'm asking for me, really, rather than for you, certainly not the visitors to Cambridge, who I'm conscious I may have depressed about the state of criminal justice in Cambridge. I'd like you to know that you are extremely safe on the streets of Cambridge. We could go into that if we wanted, but we have got a system which is enormously under pressure. I could spend my whole life responding to government consultations, and I certainly have consultation fatigue. And I hope by showing this slide, I might encourage some of you. I rather naughtily put this slide into my handout because I thought about those who've just arrived in this country and might be practicing their English. You might find it rather useful academic exercise to read a government consultation and to respond. Your views would be wonderfully well received and you would come with fresh eyes. I certainly would love everybody here to respond to the second bullet point, our local government's current consultation on rough sleeping. I'm a member of an organisation called the WAG, the Women's Homeless Action Group. And it is really depressing to read that the local government think that about half the homeless women in Cambridge are homeless and refusing to engage with services. When you talk to the local homeless women, they're not refusing to engage with services. There are no services available to them. There are no hostels in Cambridge for the street homeless which don't have men in them, and men are at the root of many homeless women's problems. So that's a consultation everybody might like to respond to. I am definitely running out of time, so I think I won't say anything more about any of those current consultations at the moment. I'll happily answer questions about them. How do we effect change? Our criminal justice system is not in a good place in this country. It's largely a question of money, but it's also a question of leadership and joined upness. I deliberately told you how the police, the CPS, probation, prisons, courts, they're all working in their own individual silos. Yes, we don't want them to be too coordinated. We need checks and balances on different institutions within criminal justice, but how it works at the moment is not effective. And then we would have to discuss what we want to effect. I put a few references on the last slide, but that's it. I'm stopping sharing.